name is Aubrey Shaw, and I am a PhD candidate in the Center for Ethics with Dr. Stoll. My main research line is moral reasoning in competitive populations, especially athletes. So I am getting my PhD in sport ethics. My dissertation title will be Perspective Taking and Educational Intervention to Help Pre-Service Physical Educators Become Fully Inclusive of Students with Physical Disabilities. Introduction. The introduction for this topic of perspective taking is really interesting because the literature in the field explains how students with physical disabilities are not being fully included. So, and most authors say that they are not included, they're sitting out, they're going to the library instead of going to physical education class. So it's really interesting. Rizzo and Viserpool, sorry about this green line. It was not there when I practiced this. Anyways, so Rizzo and Viserpool, they talk about, or they discuss why this is happening. And they did 2 separate studies in 1991 together. And one of them was about attitudes and the other one was about inclusion. So they found out that physical educators, their attitudes were lower towards students with physical disabilities. And because their attitudes were lower, they didn't want to include the students. Then another notable author in the moral reasoning realm is Buber. And in 1970, he wrote a book about the I, it, and the I, thou. Well, the I, thou is seeing myself as, or seeing another person as an extension of myself. So, for example, Dr. Freeman, I see you as an extension of myself. I can put myself into your shoes and see the world from your lens. The I, it is treating a person as if they were an object. So for an example, if I saw a person who had limb loss or who was in a wheelchair and I didn't see them as a person, I saw them as an object instead, that is the I, it. The next one is Lacona. And Lacona in 1991, he wrote a book about, it's called Educating for Character. And he really set the tone for perspective taking. So he defined it and he said that perspective taking was a prerequisite for moral reasoning. So we will be using his definition of perspective taking. Smith, 2009, he discusses in his articles the difficulties of perspective taking. And he actually uses the example, or the phenomenologist named Levinas. And Levinas actually discusses how the object or person it's hard to perspective take because I am always going to be me and Dr. Freeman is always going to be him. And so we have to be able to be open and work together to perspective take. Here are my key terms. We have perspective taking, which is the ability to take the viewpoint of others so we can know how they feel, react, and think. Then we have implicit biases. Remember, implicit biases are the subtle biases that lie within ourselves. They are not the biases that come out. Those are explicit biases. Then we have moral reasoning. And moral reasoning is Lumpkin, Stoll, and Beller, 2003, define it as being able to think through a moral issue while knowing their own beliefs and values and considering others' values as well. And then we are going to specifically look at, well, physical disabilities are the disabilities that we will be focusing on. So we have to define physical disability, and that is an impairment that affects a person's body functioning in time and space. So limb loss, a person in a wheelchair, a person who is blind, a person who is deaf. So we're looking specifically at physical disabilities. We're not looking at autism. We're not looking at mental impairments. We're not looking at emotional impairments. We are looking at physical impairments. My problem statement. So the purpose of my study is to examine the effects of perspective taking, or examine the effect of a perspective taking intervention on moral reasoning, judgments about inclusion, and implicit biases in pre-service physical education professionals. My subproblems. The first subproblem I have is what is the effect of perspective taking, or what is the effect of a perspective taking intervention on moral reasoning. The next subproblem is what is the effect of the perspective taking intervention on judgments about inclusion. The third subproblem is what is the effect of a perspective taking intervention on judgments about acceptance of students with physical disabilities. And then my fourth and final subproblem is what is the effect of a perspective taking intervention on implicit bias. My statistical subproblems. Number one is that there is no effect exists on a perspective-taking intervention on moral reasoning and pre-service professionals by gender. The next statistical subproblem is no effect exists on a perspective-taking intervention on judgments about inclusion and pre-professionals by gender. The third subproblem is no effect exists on a perspective-taking intervention on judgments about acceptance of students with physical disabilities by gender. The fourth one is no effect exists on a perspective-taking intervention on implicit biases and pre-professionals by gender. So who will be my participants? My participants will be pre-service physical education majors, male and female, and they have to be 18 or older. A limitation for my study will be my participants, because I am getting a convenient sample down at LCSC, Lewis Clark State College, and those the professors that teach physical education majors, they have agreed to help me out. So this is a complete convenient sample. My variables. My independent variable is the intervention program. And I have 3 dependent variables, which are moral reasoning scores, judgments about inclusion scores, and implicit bias scores. My program, so my treatment will be an intervention that consists of 6 20-minute Lessons directed towards moral reasoning, including perspective taking, decreasing implicit biases, and improving judgments about inclusion. My control group will take the pretest and the post-test, and the participants in the control group will be taught and trained like the other classmates with no additional work. So what does my treatment actually look like? So my 6 lessons are my treatment. So my first lesson is becoming aware of perspective taking. And this is, how do we actually start to perspective take? Like I said earlier in my introduction, there has been literature done on the difficulties of perspective taking. And I am well aware that it is difficult to perspective take. So the lesson 1 will be dedicated to teaching these individuals how to start to perspective take, because it's not easy. Lesson 2 of my treatment will be perspective taking and the importance of language. So we want to remember that we want to use first person language, which is Aubrey is a person with an impairment rather than Aubrey is a disabled person. So we put the person first and then we put the impairment second. We also have to understand that language can be hurtful. So what do we call a stalled car on a freeway, on the roads, in the driveway? Usually they call them disabled cars. So we have to, just like they would, call a person a disabled person. So we have to be aware of the language that we are using, and that is what lesson 2 is about. Lesson 3 is different because it is looking at perspective taking and what Stella Young calls inspiration porn. So Stella Young is a comedian, a disability advocate, and she actually coined the term inspiration porn, and she said that we keep people around with impairments because they are our inspiration. It's not very inspirational for this person to get up and go about their day. However, some people see it very inspirational. So that's why she calls it inspiration porn. We also want to examine where the participant's visual focus goes. So when you look at a person with limb loss or a person in a wheelchair, where does your focus go? Does it go to the feet? Does it go to the limb loss? Does it go to the face? So we want to examine where the visual focus goes and where should it go. So research says that the focus should always go to the face, because when you see the face, you see the person, as Buber would say, as an extension of self. My next 3 lessons, lesson 4 will be on perspective taking and beauty. So how society views beauty and the body. So literature shows that there is a connection between our society and the Greek society because we view bodies as beautiful. But how about the individuals with impairments? Are they considered beautiful? Or are their bodies considered beautiful? So we will be looking at perspective taking and beauty in that lens. Then lesson 5 will be about perspective taking and implicit biases. So how do these biases affect the way we interact with people with physical impairments? Are we uncomfortable with around them? Are we not talking to them? Why are we doing this? Could it be because we have implicit biases? Perhaps, or perhaps not. Our next lesson, our final lesson, lesson 6, will be a conclusion of all the lessons and then the final reflection. Now, in these treatments, they all have the same format. So the format will be a short discussion. Well, each lesson will have a short discussion. They will have videos for the participants to watch, and they will have activities so they can start to perspective take. My instruments for my pre-test and my post-test, I have the Hahn-Beller Values Choice Inventory, and this inventory measures moral reasoning. Their Cronbach alpha is 0.78 to 0.88. And this measures what should sport, so it gives scenarios on how sport should be played. It's very idealistic. And then people on a Likert scale, they circle their answers. The second instrument that we will be using is the Harvard Implicit Bias Test. And this measures a person's implicit bias. The really interesting part about implicit bias is that the strongest implicit bias, or not the strongest, sorry, the largest group that has an implicit bias against them are people with disabilities. And you would never think that, because you would think, oh, it's probably against race, but it's not. It's with people with disabilities. So we want to look at their implicit biases. And this instrument has a Cronbach alpha of 0.70. The next instrument and final instrument is Hodge's Judgments About Inclusion. And this instrument discusses or examines attitudes towards students with physical disabilities. So this looks directly at attitudes. And the Cronbach alpha for this instrument is 0.84 through 0.86. So my procedures of my dissertation or my study. The pre-service physical educators in both treatment and control group will take all 3 instruments that we just talked about. The Hahn-Beller Values Choice Inventory, Harvard Implicit Bias, and then the Judgments About Inclusion. The control group will not be asked back until the post-test. They are the control group, okay? The treatment group, however, they will come back each week into a computer lab and engage in an educational intervention on perspective taking. And I talked about this a little earlier, but I'm going to talk about the procedures even more. Is each lesson within the intervention is set up for the students to watch videos, engage in activities, and then reflect. Perspective taking takes reflection. Moral reasoning takes reflection. And so if the person doesn't get the time to reflect, then moral reasoning does not occur. So we need to have that time to reflect. After the 6 weeks, the treatment and the control group will come back together, and then they will take the post-test of the Hahn-Beller Values Choice Inventory, Harvard Implicit Bias, and then the Judgments About Inclusion. Now, the really big limitation of my procedures is that I want to have a randomized sample. However, people are going to have to want to do the intervention, because you can enter the study and not, you can enter the study, be in the intervention group, and not do the intervention. So in that way, I have a really big limitation, because is it truly randomized? Because they have to want to do the intervention. So right now, my procedures, they sound feasible. However, I have not worked out the logistics, and I will have to work with my collaborators and make sure that the intervention is being taken seriously and the students are actually doing the intervention. So my design of my study is a randomized pre-test, post-test design with an intervention. Right here, we have the design of the randomized pre-test, post-test, with the X being the treatment. So we'll come and take we'll have the control group, the treatment group. We will have the pre-tests, and then the one group gets the treatment, while the other group is the control, and then they take the post-test. I, as a researcher, have an ethical duty to offer the intervention to the control group after the initial study. And this will be said to before the study, because if the person in the control group really wanted to be in the intervention, well, they get to do the intervention after the initial study. So yeah. My data analysis will be in ANOVA. We will have two groups, the treatment and the control. And then we will have 3 instruments: the Hahn-Beller Values Choice Inventory, Judgment Spot Inclusion, and then the implicit bias. And then we will have, for the data analysis, we will be examining means of the groups. So we will have a lot of groups because we are going to examine them by gender. Now, why gender? In the literature, it's clear that other researchers have looked at gender, and they have found that males and females, they go about inclusion differently. Females, are usually more inclusive, whereas males are not. And so we want to examine them by gender. Okay. Therefore, we want to see if the groups improved, decreased, or stayed the same from the pre-test to the post-test by gender of both groups, and see if the intervention did what it was supposed to do. So why is this important? In the literature, it clearly states that teachers are underprepared. Martin 2018 talks about it. Rizzo and Visserpool talk about it. It's this big issue of physical educators are underprepared. Okay. Therefore, they need an educational program that will help them become prepared and to offer solutions of being included. Perspective taking is a step in the right direction of full inclusion, because perspective taking is essentially putting yourself into someone else's shoes. So if you are a physical educator and you put yourself into a child's shoes with a physical impairment and they are not being included, how are you going to feel? Okay. The whole purpose is getting you to the I thou rather than the I it. And through the I thou, you can see and feel and react in a hurtful manner. And so perspective taking really tries to get into full inclusion. Okay. We want to make a difference in the lives of not only the students with physical impairments, but the teachers as well. If they feel more prepared to teach students with physical impairments, then opportunities for them to play will happen. Thank you very much for listening, and here is my bibliography. I look forward to seeing your comments and feedback. Thank you, everyone.